Coming up, ESPN puts out their rankings of the best young cores across the NFL. Where do the New York Football Giants stand in the upcoming season? And was it a little bit of a tumble from 1 year ago? How do we feel about Kayvon Thibodeaux, the emergence of a player like Malik Nabers as a true number one, and so many other young athletes on this team deserving of a little bit of shine? We dive into it all coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where I am one of your hosts, Adam Armbrecht, as always, healthy, wealthy, and wise, talking about a few different things here, kicking off first and foremost with young core rankings as looked at by ESPN Plus article, as a matter of fact, breaking down where New York stood a year ago, where they are now, and what it could mean for them going forward. While nothing is guaranteed when it comes to young players and year-over-year growth, the New York Football Giants need some of these young guys to carry over. They need to have more hits than misses if we're going to look at the upcoming season and say, we believe that Joe Schoen, the front office, that this coaching staff has the pieces in place to start to grow year over year. There's also some interesting things taking a look at inside linebacker Bobby Okereke. Where does he succeed? Where does he fail in certain aspects of his game? And then obviously reflecting on the components around him. And then another sense of what the Giants need to do right now, winning early in the season based on their schedule, something that we may get to today, may end up talking about it with Andy. Obviously, we're going to have Hard Knocks episode later tonight. We'll be back in tomorrow morning, breaking that episode down and some of the takeaways. They're going to the Combine, so that's going to be a lot of fun to see how Joe Schoen, how Brian Daboll take a look at it. Already get the little trailer. I doubt it's going to be a focal point, but can Brian Daboll run a sub 4.740? We'll find that all out tomorrow as well. So a lot of stuff going on as we work our way through this off season. But as we said at the top, over on ESPN Plus, you had Aaron Schatz, who put out a ranking of NFL teams under 25 talent. And it shouldn't be surprising some of the teams we're going to talk about being at the top of the list. But I found it interesting to look at where the Giants are now versus where they were a year ago and how delicate this balance can be. And that's not just because, well, some players age themselves out, which every team has and the Giants had, but more importantly, because the development of a player can sometimes look a little bit shinier in year one, and then some of that rose can fall off there in year number two, or going to year number three, or in the case of an Evan Neal, that it never quite gets to the place where you feel like you can put him into that camp. So just as a table setter here, the standard used for their article and how they broke this down is number of starts by players under 25, number of snaps played by the players under 25 years old, and then the quality of the play of those players under 25, age adjusted to capture the fact that, for example, a 21-year-old player at a certain ability is more likely to improve than a 23-year-old player at a certain ability, right? So you either feel like you're a young talent that established themselves in the first couple of years in the league and you're already that level of impact player, or you're a rookie maybe, or a year two player that's about to take that next big step. And then factoring in as well for Pro Bowls and All Pro selections as well. They took a look at contracts inside of this too. So it's a catch-all, right? Where were they drafted in a particular draft class as well? And then where they're expected to be as they work their way into this season. So it should come as no surprise. I'm going to jump to the Giants here first, and then we'll backtrack and talk about a few teams that took seismic leaps in this category and the players that helped them get there. But the New York Football Giants, you might be surprised to know, were sixth last year in this same ranking system and found themselves dropping all the way down to 13th. So closer to middle of the pack than not. Key reasons inside of this: they're blue chip players as they're being referenced. Kayvon Thibodeaux, second-year player, obviously Deonte Banks, that we expect big things from on the outside. And then our prize sixth overall pick, rookie wide receiver, Malik Nabers. Those are three players when we think about the New York Football Giants right now that are very easy to get excited about, whether it's the fact that we brought in a player like Brian Burns, and we believe that another draft pick who did not come up to live to fruition in Azeez Ojulari, taking him out of the equation, putting some Brian Burns into the mix, is going to make Thibodeau's life easier, going to make his gameplay better. We said this about Dexter Lawrence as well. It's not hard to look at Kayvon Thibodeaux and project him to take that next seismic leap. Then you have Deonte Banks, who, it was interesting. Andy and I had a discussion about this. I'll put it in the show notes for today's episode, looking at where the expectations were for second-year players and looking at the cornerback rankings. And Deonte Banks was not very high up the overall NFL list And we were a little surprised by that. Not only because if you go and watch, especially the back end of this past season for Deonte Banks, the growth trajectory was there. You can just go and compare him to the other cornerbacks that came in his same draft class and say, hey, I put them ahead. I put him ahead, I should say, Deonte Banks, ahead of a lot of these other positions. So another young talent that we expect big things from. Listen, the Malik Nabers of it all, which we've also talked about before on this show, yes, it is going to correlate to how well a player like Daniel Jones plays under center. But even if Daniel Jones is a 16 to 22 ranked quarterback, and you can debate about whether or not that's too high, too low. There's a lot of things that we can get into around that. Ultimately, if you get him the volume and you make the concerted effort to put the ball in and around his persons, we expect that he is going to put forth a very impressive rookie season. We've already thrown out some numbers before. We're going to circle back to that as we get through training camp and approach the season and say, what are the expectations for a number of these players? So those three guys being in the core of what we're talking about is excellent. That's what you're hoping to see here for the New York Football Giants. Three key players, two on defense, one on offense, that stand to be the next components in this team rebuilding and getting themselves on track. Now, the notable graduating players, there's notable for two reasons. The first one is Andrew Thomas. So obviously, if we're saying, well, this team took a bit of a step back from the year prior being ranked 6th overall, right? You lost Andrew Thomas, arguably the best player on this team right now. Easily, obviously, the most critical player that they've had prior to drafting Malik Nabers and prior to thinking about the long-term future. He's excellent. He has been a stalwart for this team. But John Michael Schmitz, it's interesting, Junior, not his father. It's interesting with him, mostly because we're talking about a player that after one season we're already talking about, well, where are we going to be with him, right? What is it going to look like for John Michael Schmitz? If he's not a hit here for the New York Football Giants, then you have a different conversation coming up. Now, he's already aged himself out of this 25 conversation. That's the other part of it. He's already cresting on that line of coming out of that. So when you draft an older player coming out of the draft, you want that. You almost need that to be a more immediate hit than not. Notable things to consider as well. Obviously, we can't sit here and talk about the New York Football Giants in terms of wide receiver position and Malik Nabers and what he's going to put forth there. But we can take a look on the defensive side of the ball and say Kayvon Thibodeaux, a player that, listen, I feel like how many reps he ends up playing. We had this discussion. What percentage of the time he's going to be brought on blitzes. That's going to be a big factor here too. But there's not much for Deonte Banks, who only played 25 snaps in week 1 a year ago. But at the end of it, ended up playing nearly 75% of the snaps, 844 in total, averaging 56 per game. But he didn't play in the final 2 weeks of the season, only played 43 in week 16. They obviously had the bye mid-season there. But you go back and look, there's a handful of games, minor injuries, etc., where he didn't quite get all the way ramped up. Even week number 1, and the fact that he was 25 snap count there makes a big difference. Expect him to take a big leap forward in terms of the snap count that he's on the field. That's how you can relate it to being important and to being a player that is going to be a part of this core going forward. What do we expect from a percentage standpoint that they're going to be on the field? That matters in a big way. I was trying to go down here real quick to Kayvon Thibodeaux as well. Now, he ended up playing by the end of the season 87% of the snaps, 981 snaps. So the guy's out there. He's out there all the time. You expect him to be out there all the time. It'll be interesting to see how Nabers unfolds. But inside of this core group, you can already set the table. More reps for Deonte Banks, more refined in his skill set. Kayvon Thibodeaux, same amount of reps, maybe more reps, and then ultimately dial it up in terms of the production that you get out of that position. Coming back here in 1 second, though, the other handful of players that we talk about, not just the graduating guys, but they gave a list of young players, but also excluded a couple of guys that I think are kind of important for the New York Football Giants when we talk about their young core and where they rank, and then we'll compare them to the teams that took these big leaps over 1 and 2 year stretches and how New York could be in that category when we fast forward another offseason from now. We'll do that coming up here in just one moment. So as we continue along, obviously we remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Pietential, Pietential. That spells Pietential.com. It is an online, free for individual users assessment tool that sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and also tracks your progress. We said this before when it relates to the New York Football Giants or to the NFL young rookie players. Hey, know who you are. Have a sense of what you want to accomplish and make sure that you're giving yourself the tools to stay even-tempered throughout what can be an up and down rookie campaign at the NFL level. but we can even use it. You and me around day to day, just trying to keep an even keel and make sure we're working through those things that come up. Check it out today, potential.com. Turning our attention over to this top 25 list, and then this young group of players, which I find absolutely fascinating to talk about on so many different levels. Because on offense, we say Wan'Dale Robinson, 23 years old, obviously 525 receiving yards and 1 touchdown last season. Bellinger is an interesting one. They list him here, obviously, because 10.2 yards per catch, but we know different from rookie year to second year. They go and they get Theo Johnson. Where is he going to fit into this? And then they make a note of Malik Nabers. Oh, sorry, not Malik Nabers, who we mentioned earlier. Safety Tyler Nubin, also 23 years old. The one thing about this is we mentioned with John Michael Smith already being 24. Then we talk about a Tyler Nubin, 23 years old, coming in as a rookie. You have Wan'Dale Robinson. Okay, he's already been around this, right? He's had the first year. He's developed. He's shown flashes in the second season, and now it's about breaking out and really dialing it up here. The other 2 players that we have on this list are Cordell Flott and Micah McFadden. Now, when we go back and talk about those reps, which I think are telling over the course of a season, we know we've had this conversation too about about Micah McFadden. Malik Nabers is on my mind because if Malik Nabers has a good year, we all have a good year. But when it comes to Micah McFadden, if you look at a player like this and you go back and see that he played 65% of the snaps a year ago, 737. His highs are in the 50s, but there were games when he only played 23, played in the mid 30s, spiked at 67 at the midpoint of the season here. But there were some up and down sample sizes week over week. And it goes back to this idea. If you're going to put him inside of this group, and just by age alone, he falls into the category. If you're going to put him into this group, then I think you have to look at him and say, what are the expectations for as he steps into a larger role and a role that needs to be more consistent? And if we dial back here to the top for a moment, talking about that inside the linebacker room, I'll break this down more extensively. There was a good film study on Bobby Okereke, kind of talking about where he excels and maybe where he needs to improve is the wrong statement, but just areas of weakness in his game. One of the things they listed as a strength was dropping back into coverage. However, unlike where we would maybe talk about it, tracking a tight end 15, 20 yards down the field, they reference that, from 7 to 10 yards off the line of scrimmage and being able to pick up in traffic, tight end, maybe a running back out of the backfield, wide receiver coming across, and be disruptive in those passing lanes. That's quality, but it's not necessarily everything you need out of that position, unless, as we'll talk about over the course of this offseason and training camp, what are the expectations for the safety room? How are you going to mix and match those players? Isaiah Simmons is this looming Swiss Army knife player that we're not sure how we're going to see Shane Bowen utilize. So there's a lot of factors in that. The Micah McFadden of it all is that an area of weakness for Bobby Okereke is being able to work through the line of scrimmage and really get in between those tackles and be disruptive. He has a tendency, at least by film study, to sometimes get caught up in the wash a little bit. He's not the biggest linebacker in the world. He's not the most forceful player in the world. That's okay. His instincts, being a field general, getting the defense in the right positions, tracking down ball carriers, yes, these are all positives. And we love having Bobby Okereke. But then it makes you look at a Micah McFadden and say, okay, if we look at Bobby Okereke as being one of our best players and he checks box 1, 2, 3, and half of number 4, then we need that complement to be the other 1.5 boxes and maybe a little something extra. So if we're going to put Micah McFadden into this category at 24 years old, by the way, this is about to be the graduating class when we fast forward another year from now. Will we look back and say Micah McFadden falls into that category of a player that moved on from the under 25, but now becomes a part of those key contributors in that 25 to 28 range, which are kind of going to be your veteran, experienced core guys that continue to play consistently while elite veteran talent and then young rookies, first, second year players continue to develop. Cordell Flott inside of this conversation is another big one too. We've had this discussion this offseason. Are they going to stand pat and put Flott out there and say, hey, this is your job to win or lose. It's your job to sink or swim. Go through the growing pains. Expectations matter. He played 46% of the snaps a year ago, 518, averaged 37 per game. The upside here is in week 17 and 18. Now, obviously, you didn't have Banks out there, 57 and 48 respectively. Overall, though, because those are on the high side, you're talking about a guy that played 30 to 35-ish reps per game. Had some spikes, week 6, week 7. And by the way, also missed some time at the start of the season from a rep standpoint. So Cordell Flott, you go by the numbers, long, lean. Has he put on a little bit more muscle mass this offseason so he can play a little bit more physically as we talk about wanting to move him to the outside? He's a guy that if he hits here as well, another player, he falls in with McFadden graduating out of this age range here at 24, going to be 25 years old. Well, if you're sitting here being a middle of the pack team, you need, if we dial it back here, okay, Kayvon Thibodeaux, hit, right? We know what we're getting from him. Deontay Banks, hit. We know what we're getting from him. Malik Nabers, we feel pretty darn confident. We know what we're going to get from him. So this under 25 core, though, then needs McFadden to be consistent. It needs Cordell Flott to be consistent. I personally am high on Wan'Dale Robinson. I think that a lot of these numbers that we saw a year ago from him, the unflashy thing is the 525 yards. The very flashy thing, though, is taking a look at a couple of numbers, which we'll get into now here on Wan'Dale and why I maybe even move him into that elite category. You can't put him as a blue chip player right now coming into the season. But a year from now, when he's only 24 years old and you redo this list, I would like to think we could have a conversation, at least a conversation, about him being a part of the New York Giants core blue chip under 25 players. So here's why. Pro Football Focus, Lauren Gray, ranked the NFL's top wide receivers by open target rate from the 2023 season, where the Giants' third-year wideout landed at number 2 overall. Quoting her, had tied for a team-high 76 targets in 2023, a 26.9% clip, and he led the team in catches at 60, missed tackles forced at 13 while recording 7 gains of 20-plus yards. Now, that's with only having 525 total receiving yards here, right? 29 first downs put into that. He has the second highest separation rate for the Giants in his first 2 NFL seasons, 93.4%, as well as the second highest target rate of 27.5. Now, is that target rate going to drop when we talk about having a player like Malik Nabers in this room now? Of course it is, right? He's going to have to probably make more out of potentially less. But his catch percentage rate was excellent. The separation rate is excellent. The missed tackle rate is excellent. And I think when you talk about introducing, even though you lost a player like Darren Waller, even though you've lost a player, even just veteran experience in the locker room, let's put it that way, and Sterling Shepard. But the fact that you have Malik Nabers now, we're going to talk about Jalen Hyatt here in a second. The fact that you have Theo Johnson, who I understand he's a rookie, but he's an athletic tight end mold. Bellinger still here. A handful of different kind of weapons in the backfield. Yeah, I think Wan'Dale Robinson is right on the verge of getting put into that elite conversation about our young core as opposed to being treated kind of like an on-the-fence guy. And I say that mostly because the other player listed here in Tyler Nubin, again, now one of our blue chip guys is a rookie that hasn't seen the field yet, and one of our other high talented players that hasn't seen the field yet is Tyler Nubin. How is he going to get utilized? Are they going to kind of use him in a couple of different versions of this? And can you see him, the ball hawking traits that he exhibited in college? If that translates to the pros, then you're talking about a guy who's going to probably be high impact, even on low volume early in his career. The last guy you see here, Mr. Daniel Bellinger. Some people have thrown out ideas about whether or not he'll be on this roster, or could he be a guy that the Giants would trade, or any of these other number of things. I didn't understand it then. I don't understand it now. But if you go and look at him from last season, remember that by the end of the year, he was a player that played 62.3% of the snaps offensively, 688 snaps, averaging 40 per game. The reason why it's interesting is because if you dial it back 1 year prior, understanding that he was a player who missed significant time with the eye injury, he still played over 50% of the snaps a year ago, 574. Did not play in weeks 8 through 12, though. Week 9 was a bye, but weeks 8, 10, 11, and 12 because of that eye injury. So where this player was going and what he was building towards, did that get derailed a little bit? And then you see him come back into the fold there, plays over 60 and 65 snaps per game, weeks 13, 15, 16, and then all the way into week 17, does not play in week 18 ultimately. So he's a very interesting player to watch here, not only from a production standpoint, but also from a narrative standpoint. Like, just where is he in the pecking order? We still believe in him. We believe that he and Theo Johnson can form a nice tandem here, but it does come down to complementary football, helping the offensive line, blocking. We've also noted the special teams value that a lot of these players have showcased, especially after maybe a little bit more of a flashy first season, a down second season. So how they balance that out really matters here as well. But next, let's go ahead and turn our attention not only to this list overall, because there's some very clear things here that are going on for the New York Football Giants as we run live on YouTube on One Giant Podcast. Where did other teams see seismic jumps from the year prior? And how clear and easy is it for the Giants to make that leap in the upcoming season? And what's the correlation to winning football games on Sundays and on Mondays and on Thursdays and sometimes Fridays and Saturdays and every other day in between? We'll get into that all coming up here in just one moment. As we continue today's One Giant Podcast live on YouTube, thank you for being a part of it. Tomorrow, we'll be breaking down the latest Hard Knocks episode, talking about the combine there. Certainly has to be something that everybody is interested in hearing how the Giants approached it. Who were some of the players they looked at? We talked about those top 30 visits that the Giants had, and then targeting players who worked their way towards the draft. Unclear if we'll get all the way to draft, snippets here in the second episode. But we're going to see the combine. We're going to hear how they talk about these players, probably get some interview samples as well from some of the key figures. Before we do that and wrap up today's show, though, I'll tell you about Personam. Personam is an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine. Personam improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. Check out Personam today. So we've walked our way through the Thibodeaux Banks Nabers of it all. Very exciting. Elite talents. Believe in them. We've gone through some of the mixed bag here, which, again, I can make a strong case that I believe in Robinson already, but Nubin, a rookie, obviously. McFadden needing to prove that he can probably do it consistently at a higher volume alongside Bobby Okereke. Cordell Flott getting an elevated role for the first time maybe in his career here. Big opportunity for him. And by the way, just as a note, we look through all of these players here, right? A reminder, we're now into all the Joe Schoen guys. And that's just obvious when you've been with the team and you've had 3 drafts now to build out your roster. But this is all now the Joe Schoen era of New York Football Giants football. Yeah, we'll go and double down on that. And one of the reasons why I remind you of that is 2 players that are not on this list when it comes to the Giants. Before we talk about the overall rankings here, the Giants dropped from last year's ranking of 6 because some of their recent high draft picks were disappointing in 2023. 2 among them, Evan Neal, who ranked dead last among qualifying right tackles in pressure rate allowed. We've all been there. We all know the story. And edge rusher Azeez Ojulari, who had just 2.5 sacks, but both players still have growth potential, with Neal at age 23 and Ojulari 24. Now, we've already talked about these 2 guys. Ojulari is a holdover from the previous regime, so that's certainly noteworthy here as he hits 24, contract year, brought in Brian Burns and all that goes along with that. And then the other side of it, yes, this is a Joe Schoen guy in Evan Neal, and you better believe that they're going to give him every opportunity to be successful, brought in veteran players on this offensive line. You would like to think that there is the opportunity still for him to be successful with this team going forward. And let me go one more layer here. Talk about this list overall first, and then I want to get back into where we are in terms of other players that fall into this sub-25 category that don't get mentioned, but I think are very deserving of it, and I think we'll be talking about when we come back around another year from now. There'll be a handful of guys that will or will not be on this list, but are going to be factors in this season and how the Giants move forward. So overall, when we talk about this ranking, here's things that I really like about it and should be encouraging for the New York Football Giants. Top of this list was the Houston Texans. And that's not hard. Why? Because you hit on C.J. Stroud. Then you also have Will Anderson Jr. on the edge. You have Derek Stingley Jr. as well on the outside playing cornerback, which, remember, that was a controversial kind of decision at the time when they were in that draft class. That has paid off for them. Notable graduates for them, Nico Collins falls in there at the wide receiver category. The reason why it's not hard is because you hit on the quarterback. That's going to make you take a big jump. But remember, they were first last year on this list too. So this is just a young core. And if you rewind a year ago, hey, yeah, they lost some tight games. 2 years ago, lost some tight games. Felt like they were right there on the edge of it. Then you get that missing piece of the quarterback. He elevates the play of others like Nico Collins. Now, all of a sudden, you're coming into a season where it feels like this franchise is picking up a lot of steam. Detroit Lions, very notable. 3 a year ago, 2 this year. No surprise, Sewell and Hutchinson, Laporta, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Gibbs. There's just a ton of young talent on this team. I'm not going to belabor that. Here's one that I do think is interesting, though. 30th a year ago in 2023, the Baltimore Ravens, now led by their blue chip players, Kyle Hamilton, Zay Flowers, and Linderbaum at the center position. That's how quickly you can do it. And Patrick Queen just left in free agency and was also aging himself out of that category too. Like there are real easy steps that you take here when you hit on your draft picks. So when you hit on a player like Kyle Hamilton, who some people, a little bit of questions, where would the fit? How's it going to work out? Of course, naturally, because he goes to the Baltimore Ravens with kind of their historic defensive lineage, especially at the safety position, it feels like that'll work out. He goes anywhere else, maybe it doesn't. Who knows? Could be a mixed bag. But because he goes to Baltimore, it works. Linderbaum hitting for them really matters, and it works. And then having a skilled position player like Zay Flowers to go along with their other young core. You also have, so there's just this team from 30th to 3rd, that's seismic. You work your way down the list. Atlanta's there, Chicago's there. They're already in this kind of category. Then you get to the Arizona Cardinals, now 6th, 28th a year ago. Why? Because Johnson Jr. there on the offensive line, Marvin Harrison Jr. at the wide receiver position, Michael Wilson at the wide receiver position, just had Zaven Collins exit out of the sub 25 range. But again, when these players all hit and start to show that flash of production, and then you bring in rookies that are at high caliber expectations, you dial this forward and say, yeah, we could be looking at a team that has a lot of success early on in this season, or at a minimum has a core that's ready to excel. Jacksonville at 7, they were 5 a year ago. Here's another one, LA Rams. Now here's a version of this team. And by the way, in a few of these, not all of them, we were talking about sub 25, quarterback becomes a big factor here. Now, a lot of other teams it can't be, because one of your best players on the Rams, well, yeah, it's Stafford. How long is he for the NFL? We don't know. But when Puka Nacua comes out of nowhere and absolutely lights the world on fire, yep, you're going to go from 32 to 8. Then you have Avila at the center guard position, and also Byron Young as well. For a team that went all in a few years ago and said, listen, man, we're going to give a lot up here. It's going to be an absolute free-for-all in terms of what our future looks like. That team found a way to, all of a sudden, through drafting and smart decision-making and having some money free up, they're now reconstructing their core in the background. Won a championship, stayed competitive, started to fall back a little bit here, but it's not going to be hard to squint and see them re-engage themselves right back into that kind of conversation. So these teams that take the big leaps should be encouraging in a lot of ways for the New York Football Giants. And then we get to, by the way, in the top 10 category here, Green Bay Packers, 17th a year ago. This is another example of the quarterback spot, right? Jordan Love, Christian Watson, and Zach Tom. And by the way, when you go through these lists, a lot of them include what? Probably a quarterback, wide receiver, offensive line. Every one of these inside, as I check out the 10th overall, which was the Seattle Seahawks, taking a little bit of a step back here. But they have Charles Cross on their offensive line, only 2 players in their blue chip category. But they have players that graduated out of the sub 25. Lucas on the offensive line, Woolen, who I was a big fan of coming out of college, on the outside, and then Mafe as well on the edge. So, you talk about that team, but top 10 offensive linemen listed, 9 offensive linemen gets listed, 8 offensive linemen gets listed, right? All the way. 7 has it with the Jacksonville Jaguars. You see it there with the Arizona Cardinals. You see it there with the Chicago Bears. Like, that's the theme here. You need to have some of those young players. And going back to the Giants at 13, obviously, Andrew Thomas aged himself out. John Michael Schmitz Jr. just aged himself out. As long as they're guys that just came away from it, we already know Thomas, but having JMS hit here is really important for the Giants. As long as these guys figure it out, as long as your center then figures it out, now we're talking about something. Now we can have some success here. And those big leaps are important. And in a lot of ways, when you think about the Giants' young core relative to these other teams that we're listing, especially the ones that got quarterback, Chicago listed up there, having Caleb Williams as well, some of this stuff just pushed the Giants down a few notches because teams that got QBs, that matters. Trevor Lawrence is listed there for Jacksonville. So those things are going to matter. 12, Anthony Richardson with the Indianapolis Colts in spite of those injuries, right? So the Giants kind of get, maybe if other teams didn't have these quarterbacks coming in, maybe they'd still be top 10 in terms of the young core. Fast forward a year from now, Giants go ahead and get their quarterback in the draft potentially. Now you ratchet them right back up the board here. And at that point, hopefully we're talking about Kayvon Thibodeaux, another big year under his belt. Deonte Banks establishing himself as an elite outside corner. Malik Nabers bursting onto the scene, right? Same thing. Consistency from Wan'Dale Robinson. Cordell Flott shows that he can be the number 2 corner. That would be critical here. Tyler Nubin, bursty plays, right? Impact plays. McFadden and Bellinger, same kind of thing here, right? Carve out your roles, define your roles, and then play them with consistency. So all these things really matter. Kansas City took a bit of a step back there. They're 14th. 15th was the LA Chargers. This team is obviously in a little bit of flux and transition, but when you get your coach, you feel like you've got something you can do there. And then how about this? This is another good note here. Ties to the New York Football Giants. 29th a year ago, 16th this season, the Buffalo Bills. Kincaid, Cyrus Torrance, and Rousseau on the edge. Now, they lost Bernard aging out at the linebacker spot here, too. But that matters. It matters. And they also list Coleman, cornerback Benford, 23 years old, Elam as well, first-round pick in 2022. There are guys in this list. When you are a team, and the Giants aren't there yet, we hope they'll get there. When you're a team that has been building, trying to get over that hump, trying to get past the Kansas City Chiefs of it all, and you've come up against that ceiling a few times, you miss that window of Josh Allen and the rookie contract. Then you give him the big money. Now you're trying to play through that. You get to Stephon Diggs. Now you're trying to play through that. Now you're trying to recalibrate and rebuild yourself still in the Josh Allen, very clear, wide open window at the QB position. But finding a way to get young real quick like this and have that young core be successful, that matters to this team and how they look going forward. Applies to the Giants. It's at a much lower scale here, right? We're talking about going from being a team that is mostly irrelevant towards the end of the season to being irrelevant, to still being in the mix for maybe a wild card picture, right? And having these players hit more often than not. So when we look back, 1, 2, 3 players there, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 players there. Out of these 8 guys, can we talk about 5 or 6 of them getting those second contracts? Something that draft picks for the New York Football Giants have not done a lot of. And in that vein, we'll close out looking at the Giants roster right now and putting out some other names here for you. There's not a lot of them. By the way, just noteworthy that Malik Nabers is 20. So he'll be on the Giants young core list this year. He'll be there next year. He'll be there the next year. He'll be there the next year. And then hopefully into that second contract as he starts to establish himself. A big glaring question mark for me is the omission of Jalin Hyatt in this conversation. He's 22 years old, so he fits the criteria there. Talk about his sample size from a year ago. We understand that he did not get on the field as much as maybe we would have liked, especially in a season when there was not everything to play for. A little bit tricky when you talk about Daniel Jones' injury, regardless of what you think about him and his QB play. Tommy DeVito, right? Tyrod Taylor. That mixed bag can be tricky for a rookie to acclimate to. But he played 25 snaps in week 1. And you thought, okay, here we go. Then sub 20 for the next 2 weeks. Spikes at 45 in week 4, 33, 56, 48. Big bulk in the middle of the season there, but then does thin out down the stretch a midpoint of that season there, 17 and 29 in weeks 10 and 11. By the end of the year, though, and we talked about this before, but he played in 50.5% of the snaps, 557 average, 32 per game. I was almost surprised by how high that number was. You get big spikes at the end of the season, 57 in week 17, 44 in week 15. So there's some big numbers there down the stretch. I need to see the growth for him. I need to see that next step for him. Because when I go over and I look at Jalin Hyatt, and we talked about this too, 23 catches, 373 yards. Okay, I mean, it's something. It's not nothing, but it doesn't blow your socks off. So I get it. Well, you're going to include him in this discussion. 16.2 yards per catch, though. That was good for top 30 in the NFL. That felt like that mattered. That felt significant to me, right? And when you go and look at his game log over the course of that season, it's noteworthy that you don't have big sample sizes early in the year. 2 catches, 3, 2, 2, 1. There's only one time in this entire season, that game in late November, the 26th, when they took on the Patriots, 5 catches and a 10-7 win on 6 targets, 109 yards, right? So talk about a guy that had 200 plus yards overall for the season. 373 yards overall for the season on 23 catches. Well, a third of that came in one game. So I know the sample size is small, but if it's me, I didn't put him into this picture group here. Failed to make the extra graphic. Shame on me. But I would look at him and say, that's the guy we're going to talk about. That's the guy that a year from now, when we look at a player like Jalin Hyatt and we talk about the young core, 22, he'll be 23. He is as much a part of that discussion as anybody else. And guess what? In that vein, we could be sitting here a year from now and saying, young core, under 25. And as we've gone through this list on ESPN, we're talking about blue chip players, 2 for some teams, 3 for a lot of teams. Well, if we're going to have the conversation about it, that a player like Thibodeaux isn't going anywhere, a player like Banks isn't going anywhere, Nabers likely is going to put himself and cement himself into this category. Listen, how do you define blue chip? But I could very easily see it be that this second core here, at a minimum, includes a guy like Jalen Hyatt, obviously, but it includes these guys on a level where we know that these guys are making those plays, where we know that they're giving you the consistency you need on the field. So we could be having a very different discussion a year from now, where instead of just 8 players that we're immediately discussing, we're talking about 10 to 15 guys, because again, another draft class is going to be coming in the door as well. One last note when we talk about it too, as I was mentioning, some of the key age players that you can look at here. Daniel Bellinger already mentioned. We're not going to say anything about a guy like Deshaun Corbin, who's bounced around, could be practice squad destined. We don't know. Theo Johnson is interesting, though. He's a player to keep an eye on. I'm not saying you should put him into this list, but he's 23 years old, so drafted a little bit older. That matters. You're going to talk about a player like Evan Neal, we mentioned earlier. Well, all of a sudden, if he can even get into like the okay category, maybe that's unlikely for us. And then you have a couple of other guys, and really the only, well, actually, I am going to give you 3. I thought about only giving you 2, but I'm going to give you 3. Joshua Azuda, that's the first one. Joshua Azudu is being lined up to potentially play swing tackle reps here. There's a world where Joshua Azudu comes in and he is going to be playing significant reps for this team. It would be a big boom for Joe Shane because they drafted him fairly high in the mid rounds and they need him to be a hit for them. And also because if there is uncertainty around Evan Neal, you'd like to have that backstop. 24 years old. He'll age out this year. So how does he age out of the young core parameters that get put on this article? By getting himself into a position to be a contributor for this team going forward. Bryce Ford Wheaton, 24 years old, 6'3", 220. Talk about that wide receiver core. If he can stay healthy, and that doesn't seem to be the case, but if there's ever a world where he could stay healthy, this is a big year for him to be talked about in that, exiting out of the 24 into the 25 year of their career. And then Eric Gray. Eric Gray is the last guy I'm going to list. Actually, I should say there's going to be 2 more here because Eric Gray is the first guy, obviously drafted. Then you get rid of Saquon Barkley, you go get Devin Singletary, and then you bring in another sub-25-year-old, and that is one Tyrone Tracy Jr. So 2 running backs here, both 24 years old, about to exit their way out of the young core range, but especially for Tyrone Tracy Jr., we could be talking about him a year ago as one of those guys that graduated out, but it doesn't matter because we got the sample size we were hoping for, because the transition from wide receiver to running back allowed him to be a little bit of a movable chess piece for the offensive side of the ball, for Brian Dable, for Mike Kafka, for this entire offense. So we come back to that core again. We talk about some of these players. It's not hard to squint and think about the high value that a lot of these guys can have for this team. It's just about putting all the pieces together. So we mentioned all the way through the NFL under 25 rankings where some of these teams really hit. For the sake of conversation, if you just want to know, a couple of the worst teams are going to be the Miami Dolphins because they're trending older. Notable graduates are Jalen Waddle, Austin Jackson, Phillips as well. So they lost players out of that category. They don't have any blue chip players under 25 because they have Tua, because they have elite talent that is obviously Tyreek Hill. It's obviously well beyond being 24 and 25 years old. So that makes sense, but they're still a really good team. But they're also a team that was 24th last year and 32nd this year. So, you know, that win now-ish window is right there as they have those contract discussions with Tua. 31st is Vegas. No surprise there either, right? Farham graduated out. O'Connell graduated out. So they're in a weird spot right now, and you would expect that transitioning team. Up the board, you go with teams like the Saints. The Eagles, if you want to look inside the division, are interesting as well because they have just one blue chip player in defensive tackle, Jalen Carter, and then the guys that just came out of that group, a Devonta Smith, a Dickerson, a Juergens, and also a Blankenship. All of those guys, we know what the expectations are for that team, but teams that did it like the Rams, they were lower, and now they've resurged back up. Teams like Philadelphia, they're finding themselves falling back as they start to see that age window maybe close in on this iteration of going forward and winning right now. You go out, you get Saquon Barkley because you are in that age category where, hey, let's spend some money, let's go for it right now, and then recalibrate and readjust our roster and our expectations. So teams like that are all falling near the back end of this. Interesting to see how young cores of teams perform and impact wins and losses ultimately. Giants are 13th. It doesn't mean that they're going to be the 13th best team in the league. That's not something that we need to debate. But ultimately, we talked about this top 25 list. We talked about inside that linebacker room because McFadden directly ties to a little bit of Bobby Okereke. We'll go deeper into that after we get out of the Hard Knocks review tomorrow. So later in the week, we'll hit those points as well. And then, as I said, wasn't sure, and ultimately I did not get there. Early or never. Another article talking about how the New York Football Giants, maybe unlike a lot of teams, they fall into a smaller category who need to have success early if they want to have a successful season. Andy, who will be back in tomorrow, believes that's true for every team. But for the New York Football Giants, it's more critical if you want to have a successful year. That's based on expectations. It's based on the schedule of the teams you play, and it's based on the talent on the roster. So it's all stuff that we have coming up here, including a big announcement regarding our YouTube channel and a way that if you want to, you can support us at another level. That's really going to help us with no obligation, but it's something that we want to introduce as well as some other things we have going on this off season. And the way you stay in the loop is to get over to YouTube. Turn on your notifications so you know when we're going live. Be a part of the conversation if you want. Get over where you get the podcast feed and go ahead and subscribe. Subscribe over on the podcast feeds. If you're doing it here on YouTube, we greatly appreciate it. Do us the extra lift. Go subscribe. If there's a chance to leave a review, bang, 5 stars, 10 out of 10, whatever it looks like. We really appreciate that as well. You can support our sponsors too in Personam and Potential. In the meantime, over on Twitter at Adam Armbrecht, at AMAC214, and at One Giant Podcast. Thank you for joining us in on a little Monday live on YouTube. Is that right? Tuesday. I don't know. Tuesday live, but it's okay. Listen, we're all waiting for Hard Knocks. That's all that matters right now. Thank you for being a part of it, guys. Join in on the discussion. Get after us on social, on YouTube, on the podcast feed. And until next time, until the best times, if Andrew Makowitz were here, he would want, need, and nay demand the people know. As always, let's go Big Blue.